Hello? Hello? I think that's good, right? Okay. Well, hi everyone. Hello, hello, hello. Um, Thank you, Jason, for that wonderful introduction. Um, that was pretty amazing. Uh, it's really great to be here. Thank you also, Dean Poole and Rana. um, for just kind of shepherding me around, inviting me here. It was really great to meet students today. I think I may have visited 6 classes, 6 studios, and saw a really interesting range of projects. And yeah, I got a very good feeling for the school. So let's see. I don't really have to introduce myself because Jason did such a great great job. But what I guess I could start by saying is, like what I'll show is work that I've done over the course of 20 years, kind of starting before, like with my kind of early research projects, kind of going into practice with my partner, and more recent projects. So, so my partner Sunil Bald and I, we began our design firm. We sort of started small, just doing what we could do most immediately ourselves, which was like installations. At the time, there weren't that many venues for exhibiting architecture, so we tended to exhibit in art contexts. Over time, we ended up with art institutions as clients. We also are both academics as well as having this practice together, and one of our clients is a university. So the projects that I'm going to show are just some of them. It's actually quite a lot of slides, but not all of the work. But I wanted to kind of focus on like 3 areas. Like one area deals more with societal structures and how they are manifested in architecture, and like maybe one scale of like structuring or patterning, and then another set of work deals with maybe like a little bit more formal concerns, but also looking at structure and surface patterns, and then kind of larger scale works that are very much about like the architectural object, but then as our practice has kind of developed over time, we've become really interested in like surface patterning and facades. So starting, this is the project that Jason mentioned, which was a project that I actually did I began it in my free time, which wasn't very much, when I was working in a small boutique architecture firm in New York right after I graduated. So we worked like 60 to 80 hour weeks, but then in my free time I was kind of doing this project, and it was kind of a way for me to let off steam from the work I was doing. And it basically, it's a women's urinal, a prototype for a women's urinal, and it started by reading this manifesto in what was called a fanzine. It was called Girl Frenzy, and it was part of the Riot Girl movement, which was a movement that had, it was kind of like a punk movement for women who were young and it was largely music-based and art-based. And so I basically read the manifesto and had never really thought about bathroom habits, except that I did have a job. One of my early jobs was for a interior design firm where I was part of a team surveying restrooms, and it was one of those kind of thankless jobs where you're like surveying service facilities, and so I like surveyed the women's rooms, and my partner, who was a guy, surveyed the men's rooms. And at the time, I didn't think of it as like a necessarily negative thing, but we were surveying modern office towers in Midtown. And what was really interesting in these office towers was that what I saw was the kind of social mores in the bathroom, because these buildings were built in the 50s, was really different than now. So most of them had, for the women, they had a waiting area. So there was like a place where women could rest. And then there was like a place where you could, like with mirrors and things like that, and then toilets. So this kind of space of rest was something that's really interesting, and actually restrooms in Japan have that for women, but most restrooms now don't have that for women, like this space where you can rest. So I was looking at a lot of bathroom specs, and I decided to make my own bathroom spec and kind of like project, it was kind of like looking at the toilet, the urinal, from a point of female subjectivity. And I started to do, this is the very, very first thing I did, which is a series of drawings, which kind of like conflate the object with the human body. And then when I applied to the Whitney Museum Independent Study Program, I applied with this drawing, and they basically like, they encouraged me or dared me to build it. So while I was there, I built it. I blew the drawing. The drawing was, 24 by 36, and then I blew it up full scale and kind of began to study the making of the object. So the actual object changed from the drawing, and I kind of measured and modeled it off of myself. You'll notice like there's a urinal, but there's also a mirror, and this was done at the time where there were really long queues for women's rooms, and part of the excuse for why there were long lines was that women spend so much time putting makeup on. So that's why there's a mirror in this, but also part of it has to do with just kind of a play on identity. The project began with just a lot of research in the way that women are taught toilet training, like for not just women but women and men, and the kind of things like modesty about like female bodies, and just this whole kind of complex of issues that came up in doing this project. So one of them had to do with identification. A lot of what I read saw women as some kind of aberration or problem, which really kind of shocked me when I was reading about toilets, urinals, looking at, I looked at, what do you call it, self-help manuals and things like that. So the language was kind of interesting, shocking. And I tried to just play with that in this project. The other thing was issues of modesty and trying to keep your clothes on while you are standing to use this restroom. So I ended up designing like these pants and kind of accessories that went with it. These are images from Alexander Kierer's The Bathroom, who was an architect he was pretty much the only person who had done a bathroom study that I could look at when I did this. The urinal also came with I basically translated the drawing into a type of floor plan to instruct people how to use it. So it would be on the floor, and you would basically like put your feet in the feet where the drawing was, and then you could use the object. It was installed in like art fairs, like the Gramercy Art Fair in New York, which is now called the Armory Show. So there it was in a hotel in New York, and then also in Los Angeles, and it was actually in a bathroom. And when it was there, I hooked it up so that it took water from the sink. It was very parasitic, and then waste would go into the toilet. So it was operating and people could use it. This is actually my gallery exhibition for my final show. Here it was hooked up with water bottles, so it could be used here too, but it was more of a gallery setting, so people didn't use it. This is in New York in the installation, and that's that. Okay. So the kind of next project, which looks at societal structures, is Intimate Landscapes of the Shotgun House. And this is in Project Row Houses in Houston, Texas. And this was an invited installation. I was given this house, Frenchie's. It had a name. And each person who was invited was given a house. And we were encouraged to just explore the shotgun house as an architectural type. So I was really, I don't know, I kind of entered this in two ways. One had to do with just this kind of mythology of the term shotgun and the kind of latent violence of the term. So part of the background of the shotgun name is the double doors. So there's a door in the front and a door in the back, and they align with each other so that, like, if one were to shoot, the bullet would go straight from one to the other. But it's a very kind of violent, I don't know, like sort of idea to kind of put onto the house. So I was also interested in the shotgun as a place that was kind of, from the research that I did, was also like linked to African Americans and a kind of vernacular dwelling. So in some of the research that I was doing, I found that there was a connection to West African dwellings and shotgun dwellings. Reading that research, I also started to think about just historic inhabitants over time. So like poor inhabitants in this place, but not just like poor African Americans, but like they're the people who they descended from. And so as I was reading about the shotgun houses, there was a connection to West Africa and to slavery, and how a vernacular form could kind of translate from one culture to another. So it got me to just kind of questioning like issues of domesticity over time, issues of domesticity for people who didn't have freedom. Like what was domesticity? Could domesticity exist in a context where one is not free? So that basically set up for me a kind of question, and I tried to answer that question in my research by reading more about the shotgun house, but then also reading narratives, slave narratives, to try to find traces of domesticity. And basically, like, the idea of the house was to project paths that, like, say, the shotgun path, or paths where walls used to be, because the house had been kind of gutted, paths where walls used to be, and then also these traces of domesticity into the house. There were, I think, 3 zones. One zone had to do with the plantation fields, which was generally a place where slaves ran away, even if temporarily, just to kind of have community. So what I found in the narratives was that the fields around plantations were a place where slaves could kind of gather and in a sense have community. They could meet slaves from other plantations. Granted, the fields were very policed, so it was dangerous to be in them, but it was also a place where you could come together. Another area in the house is a kind of idea of a hearth. So one of the type of texts that I found were these texts that had to do with people, like traces of love. So people who may have been free, who then chose to become or remain enslaved so that they could be with someone they loved. And so these were things that I didn't really expect to see, and it was just very, very interesting. Another type of narrative I found was a sense of self-consciousness, where one is a story of a girl where it was after slavery ended, she was freed, but she stayed with the people who had owned her because she didn't have anywhere else to go. And one day some soldiers came and told her she had to leave, and they put her on a horse, and they, kind of like took her away, but they didn't let her take something that was very precious to her, which was like a dress with, I don't know, some pattern on it or something. But she kind of, like, her consciousness of this thing that was very important to her was one of the narratives that were projected in. So the house has kind of 2 states. There's like a house of light and a house of dark that has to do with projecting lights and shadows through the narratives into the house itself. I'll just kind of stop there. Okay, so the last one I'll show, like this, is called de facto de jure, which means by law, by custom. And this was also a group show. There are 13 cities. Each was a kind of installation. The cities were along a historic migration route. So basically this is a migration, north-south migration route on the East Coast on what was called the Crescent Line, the Southern Crescent Line. It's now just called the Crescent Line, and it's part of Amtrak. And so this was a train route that many African Americans migrated from south to north on in the 20th century. I was given the city Philadelphia, which is number 3 at the top. And I was really interested in being given Philadelphia, of the role of Philadelphia within the whole kind of the narrative of America and the narrative of freedom. And so I basically used that city as a way to measure all the others. And what I worked with on this project was public accommodations. So public accommodations are things like transportation modes, like streetcars, buses, elevators, trains, boats, things like that, or restaurants, things that have to do with consumption, public consumption, restrooms, water fountains. These were spaces that restrictions were placed upon at different times in the history of the United States. And so this project was looking largely at the period in between the first Civil Rights Act after Reconstruction and the second Civil Rights Act in the 1960s. I mean, the first thing when I was doing this project was that I didn't realize that there was a prior Civil Rights Act, and that the one in the 60s was not, the only one. So looking in that time period, which is also the time period which is referred to as the Jim Crow era, looking at public accommodations, I did a series of maps. So I worked in a team with former students who we just mapped public accommodation laws to try to understand this landscape of restrictions. So the whole project became about the space of the train as a space of freedom. The train itself can kind of go through states, and people use the train as like a place to kind of move from one space to another, and that flow is like a flow of freedom. But then from state to state, depending on where one would get off the train, the landscape might be radically different, and you had to kind of know the rules in one place or another. So the impetus for this project was a guide called the Green Guide, and it was for African American travelers. It was kind of like a Yellow Pages, or just this kind of guide that let them that had establishments that were safe to go to along this north-south route if you were driving. So this map is about the space of the train. So it's all about the flow of the train. This map is much more about the topography. So in this one, the one on your left, it's taking each city, and then from the train station out, looking at a kind of topography of restrictions from most public, which is the train station, to most private, which is home. And then this is another map looking at these restrictions. So basically, this is the kind of positive, negative map, which ends up having northern cities at the top and southern cities at the bottom. And what it ends up mapping is these are laws that were passed that were for spatial integration. These were laws that were passed for spatial segregation. And you can see in the south, and this is from 1860 to 1960, where the laws were passed in, and that's basically 1860 to 1960 for the north, where the laws were passed in cities. So interesting things that kind of were revealed in this process were people breaking the law, the way that a law would be passed in one direction or another, and then another law would come that would have to kind of ramp up the language to make sure that people weren't breaking the law. The other thing that kind of revealed the behavior of people was the penalties for laws. So in addition to doing the maps, we made a catalog for each of the 13 cities of every single law that was passed, and which public accommodation was affected. So there's this kind of graphic for the different public accommodations, and then which one's affected has a color, and there's the law, the city, the time, the place, and then the penalty. So depending on the penalty, for instance, on a train, like train travel, the penalty might be against conductors, as well as people who ride the train. So that let you know that it wasn't just the people riding the train who broke the law, but it was conductors who also broke the law. So, you know, conductors would go against a segregationary law. And then until like maybe another law was passed that heavily fined them so that they would stop doing it. So included in this is like miscegenation laws, laws that have to do with education, basically the whole gamut of public accommodations. This was all put together, so we had this data, and it's like, well, we're trying to visualize it initially in maps, and there was like just talking with the team I was working with, we just felt like it had to be something that engaged people in a very like interactive way. Like we couldn't just tell the story, it had to be something that you went through. So we kind of just came up with a really simple game which had 3 dials. One was based on the year, the other is based on where the train stops. So it's like the time, where the train stops, and the public accommodation that you'd like to go to. And so you would spin the dials, and then you would pull the card that was associated with it, and you would just kind of see what the ramifications of getting off the train at that place at that time would be. And then all of this was kind of put together in a travel valise. This was actually, the valise was kind of given, like a kind of old style train travel valise. And in the valise was mapped the kind of index of integrationary or segregationary laws, as well as putting inside all the maps that we had made that I showed earlier. So, so this was, I think on your side, the left is integration and the right is segregation. So this is Delaware, Maryland. Washington, D.C. had both. Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and then this is the box. Okay, so now I'm going to shift just a little. So it's kind of a transition project. But Mokada, the Museum of Contemporary African Diasporan Art, is in Brooklyn, New York. It's in the neighborhood Fort Greene. Some of you might have visited there. It's a small museum. It's 1,600 square feet. The client kind of approached us, and she sort of had 2 stipulations. One was she wanted a flexible space, but she wanted it to be able to have small spaces, small gallery spaces, as well as larger gallery spaces for art. And then she wanted a map of Africa in the reception area. So the approach that my partner and I took was to, rather than just put a map of Africa, we were interested in locating the African diaspora. And so we looked over time at migrations of descendants of Africa and tried to map them in a global context. And so the routes that we looked at, they were like slave routes, but also military migrations, economic migrations, kind of political migrations, and we kind of mapped them all using the time zones, which were for us like this very political, but non-geographical for the most part, kind of arbitrary system. Like the time zones are really crazy, the way that they cut through countries and go around other countries, and yeah, so we kind of were working with the migration system and this time zone system to locate the diaspora. So what you see here are the time zones, just like a kind of flattened map of that. And then this is mapped into the reception area for the museum. It was a small museum. So then we had to come up with a language for how to like model it in 3 dimensions. And the whole project was very much about a kind of 2D, 3D play. So the pattern was 2D as well as 3D. So like 2D, we took our drawings and we actually had an artist paint them on the wall. And then these are the cities, kind of as like the most forward layer that was put onto the wood slat structure that embodied the time zones. And then this is all of it together. Behind this reception area is the gallery space. So we worked with an artist to do the painting and a woodworker who used all wood joints to put this together. He was located in Ithaca and like just a real craftsperson who kind of fabricated this. Then behind the reception area was the gallery space. So in the gallery space we made a series of large panels, wall panels, that could pivot and make smaller spaces and larger spaces. So these were all kind of pivoting on a pole with a caster, and they could like fit very smoothly into the side walls to make one big space, or anything in between that. This project, Teacozy, was done in 2010. It actually was just exhibited at a place called Art Oh My. They actually have an Art Oh My and an Architecture Oh My. It's in Hudson, New York. And it was installed in their on-site series. But the first installation was 2010 at Evergreen Museum in Johns Hopkins University campus through a kind of sculpture biennial program that they had. So it's called Teacozy. It kind of came from, initially, there was a tea pavilion on the Evergreen, it was the Evergreen Mansion grounds, that was torn down. But looking at images of it, it had this just really kind of crazy ornate wallpaper that was like derived from nature and brought into this tea room. And then outside, like the building had many wrought iron nature motifs, and then it was in a very natural setting. So the kind of patterning of the landscape was really impressive, and kind of was one of the big factors in developing this. So the pattern is based on a sunflower. And it's actually a series of panels. It's panelized, but we erase the seams. So it's a series of panels of multiple sizes that are put somewhat randomly together so that it has more of an organic field. And it was laser water jet cut out of steel and kind of bent. We worked with a contractor who actually, from Baltimore, who did a lot of military contracting, and they had some off time, and they were kind of, they thought this was fun to do, and they worked with us on it. So it's installed in the landscape. So this was 2010, and it stayed for just the season, like their sculpture season. That's the mansion behind. And then we took it down after that. These are details of the steel and then the way that it meets the ground. So for me, this project was actually, it was a kind of project where I didn't have to think about heavy issues. Like I wasn't thinking about, it was in contrast to the projects which I'd shown earlier, which all had, they were very rule-based and kind of about heavy issues. This was really just about the patterns that were being explored and the kind of like translating nature into something which is more like formal. So the next set of projects are actually from what's installed in the gallery here. And this is a set of projects done for Josai University. So Josai University is in Japan, and it has 4 campuses. I think I will show projects from 2 of the campuses. There's a third, the Tokyo campus, which is outside. So my partner and I first lectured at Josai University in 1999, and then after that we started teaching there, and then in 2004 we kind of we were invited to do an architectural proposal. So what you're seeing here is the Saitama campus, and the 2 red stars are 2 sites where actually this red star, that's the building that we designed. It's this kind of hairpin shape. And then there's a second building that we designed 6 years later that's there. So the first building that we did for the school was the School of Business Management. And it's a 7,000 square foot building completed in 2006. It is a cast in place concrete building that contains classrooms, offices, 2 auditoria, a media lab, and a cafe. So basically what you're seeing here is this is an auditorium, and this is lifted up, and you enter under here, and you can actually walk behind here. There's a second level where there's a hill that if you walk through here, you go up the stairs and go onto that hill. So the building is kind of navigating this sectional topography. So I think like here you can kind of see the hairpin, and it's connected with a bridge. Then here you can see the 2 auditoria, and this is the hill, and there's the second level, which kind of butts onto the hill. On the ground floor, we designed this landscape to have a pattern, but the pattern outside also goes inside. And as it goes inside, it changes from being like stone and grass to being light, to being wood, to being carpet. So this is showing you the classroom wing. In the classroom wing, we kind of did a color palette of blues, like this kind of chromatic, very, I mean, it was kind of subtle, but like just shades of blue. And these are the public spaces, which we designed, like the floor patterns, the furniture, and in these projects, we work with a construction company. So we basically are the design architects, and we do what they call concept design, which is like a design development set here. And then the construction company, they kind of operate like a architect of record, because in Japan, the construction companies, they have all the trades, all the building trades are in them, but also all the design trades. So we have like a shadow architecture group that we work with, and we started working with them on this project. So like at this point we're really comfortable with them, and we kind of work back and forth on the details of the project, and they kind of help us with making sure that we meet like all the zoning and different requirements there. So this is that stair behind the auditoria in that first image. If you go up the stair, you're on the second level. And on the second level, it kind of goes off into the hill. So this is an image behind the big auditorium with the stair that takes you up to here. And this is a cafe, which is on this level that looks out onto the hill and the back part of the campus. So this building's in the rear of the campus. These are images on the inside of the auditoria, and this is where the pattern kind of is turned up on the wall. And then here in the media lab area, before they had media equipment, the stair is there, so the media lab is kind of like next to it, and you can see the pattern, and we use the these like big fields of color to sort of like set where gathering spaces would be. And also the oculi there, which you can see in the media space, but then here above that furniture, which we custom designed, the oculi is above it on the kind of terrace patio area. And then this is the pattern on the ground, where it's grass or tree or bench. This is the back, looking from the hill through the building. So same campus, but in the front of the campus now. So basically, this is the back of the campus, the hill, the building you just saw, and that's the main entry for the campus and the site for this next project. So it's like the first building, the gateway building to the campus. It's a museum. Mizuta is like the family who founded the museum, and they had a very famous Japanese print ukiyo woodcut collection. And so this museum was to house their collection, as well as to have a gallery. So there's a gallery. The idea was that it would be a traditional Japanese gallery for the ukiyo prints, a contemporary gallery, and then a space that was more of like a education/community space. So this is just kind of showing a little bit of the development of the project. So it's a box within a box, or a set of boxes within a box. So these are the gallery boxes. This is a glass box, a white box, a black box. The black box is the ukiyo box. And the main building is the series of closed containers on the top, an open container on the bottom with the shell wrapping around it, and it's all kind of canted and accessible by ramps on either side. So we were looking at the kind of patterning on the outside of the shell. The inside of the shell was really more about controlled environments. So this is kind of the approach, where here you can see like approaching this way, one way of entering, approaching this way, another way of entering. This now has kind of grown up as a green wall, and it's also weathered. We wanted it to be gray, but working in Japan, you don't stain things. You have to let them weather naturally. So it was brown for some time and then uneven before it became gray the way we wanted it. And also it took some time for the greenery to grow. This site was very constricted. There were 16 trees on it that we couldn't take off, so we had to work around these trees. In addition, the reason it has the two kind of ramps on the sides is that the client did not want the expense of an elevator initially, so we kind of came up with a ramp system, but eventually curators came on board like 2 years after the design, and they insisted there be an elevator, so we didn't get rid of the ramps, we just added an elevator. So here you can just kind of see the container within the container. The core in the middle, it's a very tight building, and this is showing you the two ramps. So one ramp ramps down, and it actually keeps you outside. So similar to the business school, it's this path that you can take through the project, and you can basically like not enter. You can walk through, have an experience, but you know, we kind of think of it as like a non-paying entry. So you could just experience the landscape, kind of go to the other side of the building. The ramp on the right is the one to enter into the interior. It ramps up. So this is kind of entering, going up. This is the center of the building where there's the Contemporary Art Gallery, the ukiyo-e gallery. This is the reception desk that we designed. There's a kind of like, this is this little bridge that's just kind of floating there. It's like a glass box area that only exists for that sculpture. So you can go there and stand. It's like a little meditative space above the stair. This is the traditional gallery, so it's like a very traditional space with the dark wood, dark ceiling. And then this is the stair. This is looking, so let's see. Here you're like kind of in between the kind of the galleries at the top and this open space at the bottom. And then this is the space below where the building is canted. It's not a cantilever. We almost got away with having a cantilever, but then there was an earthquake that was pretty serious, and so we had to we lobbied to get as thin a column as we could down there because they wouldn't let us not have columns after that. So anyway, so this is kind of the lower space where if you're on that ramp that goes down, you're in that gallery, which kind of is for the community and the school and the landscape, which we also designed the tier landscape, and it's all kind of indoor-outdoor space below the solid boxes. This is the back. And so here you're kind of looking through that ramp, through a kind of vestibule behind the contemporary gallery space that looks to the back of the campus. Okay, this is the last thing I'll show. This is our most recent project. It was just finished in 2016, and it's a dormitory. This is on a different campus in a different part of Japan. So this is also for a branch of the university which is called Josai International University. So Josai International University actually is like a newer campus than the other campus. The campus that we had been working on was like the original founders campus. This was the campus that the daughter of the family and her mother started. It has women's studies programs and like media studies. It's more of a contemporary focus, and it also has a large international focus. So they have students from all over the world come here, like Hungary, Brazil, Spain, Korea, South Korea, China. And this dormitory was built so that they would have a place to stay when they visited. So it's a very thin building. It's only 9 meters wide. And on the boards outside, there are 2 versions of it. The first version was the client wanted a village. Like, they didn't want the single loaded corridor, most efficient building. They wanted more this idea of a village. So we did more of a map proposal, which was very porous and had almost like residence colleges, like kind of opening into the landscape. That priced out so expensive that they couldn't do it. And so the project was shelved for a little while, but then they kind of really needed to build housing for the international students. So we had to do it with a budget, pretty extreme budget. So it went to being a single loaded corridor building, but it's actually a doubled single loaded corridor building. So it's basically a bar that's all dormitory with a small so here you can see the kind of doubling of the corridor, and this is where the doors would like open and the space would kind of become double when the weather is good. So all of this is unconditioned space, and then this is conditioned space, and these are the dormitories. The dormitories range from single room occupancy to quads. And it's really based on different price points for different students, and trying to make, to accommodate them all. So this is the main entry in the middle. To your left is the International Center entry. There's a bridge on the second floor that kind of joins the dormitories to the cafeteria and the library and a terrace above. So this is kind of looking a little bit more at that second level area and just in the entry. Then this is the reception area inside. I mean, everything here we designed the kind of logo. We had a more elaborate thing with that logo on the outside of the building, but it ended up being here. This is outside the gallery and the exhibition meeting space. So this is the gallery. And then these are some of the terraces and like just one view of the rooms. So the rooms are really economy. This is a room for 2, the bed is up here and the desk is below. And they're all kind of designed that way. There's an area where you come in where you take off your shoes. Every room has a window. They all look out on rice fields. This is a different kind of room where the desks are in front of the beds. And then just kind of shots of the balcony. And then just a little of details of the balcony. I guess I could say just a little bit about that. So this system is, it's actually a panelized system that we developed with a manufacturer of louvers in Japan, and it has like varying depths of louvers to give it this really dynamic effect, as well as like kind of varying spacing between the louvers. And so these are just shots, one from the terrace, one from outside at night, just kind of showing the transparency of the building. The doors are blue. The rest of the building is kind of just very nice concrete, not finished over the concrete. And thank you. So I'll take questions if you have any.
Thanks so much for coming out here today. Your lecture was really great.
Thank you.
As a student who is interested in traveling to Japan and working potentially in Japan, what is it like as an architect in America to work with companies such as like contractors that are architects in Japan?
So I can't say that my experience is standard because of the client. So the university was founded by the former finance minister of Japan, and the people who hired my partner and I, they basically kind of put us in the position that we had, where we're the design architects. We weren't the only architects that they hired. They have other architects who are Japanese that they hired. But so I can't really say if everyone would have an experience like the one that we've had, or like my experience. But because we were kind of accepted by our client and kind of put in this position, then everyone accepted us in that position. So so then our experience was that like it was just, we were the design architects, and if we wanted something built, we just had to draw it. If we didn't draw it, it wouldn't get built. So it didn't even matter like what it was. Like if we really wanted to get it done, we just had to make sure we drawed it, and then we would kind of work back and forth with them, and most often it got done. One of the things that I really loved was like my partner and I've studied Japanese, but I only started studying after doing this work, but we don't really speak well enough to communicate only in Japanese. And so one of the things I really love though is like they, in their education system, they sketch a lot. And so like meetings with them were always like just doing drawings. So sometimes you couldn't actually like communicate with words, and you just start drawing it, and they're like, they get it. And I think that's the most amazing thing. Like just, the kind of language of design, the tools of design are common, and so that made it very easy to work together. And I just found also the teams that we were working with were very accepting. I know it's a hierarchical society, and other people have to deal with that, but we didn't actually have to deal with that in this project. And even myself as like an African American woman, I didn't have to deal with that. And I think in part it's because the head of the university was 2 generations of women, and so they kind of set the bar. Any more questions?
Thanks for the great talk. I wonder if you'd just reflect for a second on the 2 halves of the talk. It seems like 2 halves of the talk. Some of the work just takes on a cultural weight, like a I don't know, political sensibility, and some of the work is just really great space. And not that the 2 are mutually exclusive in any of your work, but I just wondered if you help us reflect for a second on the 2 natures of your work and how you shift gears between them, or et cetera.
There's no shifting gears. They happen, so even though I showed it kind of like what might appear to be chronologically, they happen often simultaneously. So, the project in Fort Greene happened the same time as the business school. It took exactly the same amount of time, 2 years, even though it was 1,600 square feet and the other one was 70,000 square feet. Just kind of navigating the city funding process and whatever for the very small project in New York took the same amount of time for the building. And the de facto du jour happened the same time the very first version of the dormitory, the matte version of the dormitory was being done. So I think like one of the things that my partner and I in our practice, I think we used to have some anxiety about what seemed like a practice that wasn't like kind of doing, like wasn't easily categorized. We weren't just doing one thing, we were doing these different things. And over time, like that's become less of an issue. Like what's really interesting for me is that I see connections across the projects. I mean, I think we both do, where like in the project Intimate Landscapes of the Shotgun House, we were doing lots of projects that had light boxes in them, like a lot of our installations, some for the Architectural League. They're just like, I don't know, we were building light boxes a lot, and I was really into doing the wiring and stuff like that. And it was without like the kind of cultural component. It was just really, working with light and making these shapes. And the project Flip Flop, which Jason mentioned, which I didn't show, which was like our first project, it was done on like no budget and really like raw. That was like the first Lightbox project, where everything was about getting light into a 300 square foot half-level below ground space, and then that kind of carried through in like even in the business school, the way that we kind of embedded lights in the floors and in the walls and things like that. So, and then the patterns in Mokata. When we did Mokata, we did so many studies. So one of the things like in these projects is that we're often like trying to find the right like kind of formal manifestation for something. So we just do lots of studies, but then those studies become like food later. So one of the studies for Mokata, we sort of worked off that for the patterning of the Mizuta Museum, because we were doing all these kind of random patterns, and some were slits, and we sort of took things that were horizontal, made them vertical, and kind of came up with this panelized system for that. So I don't know, like some things are formal, some things are maybe more like maybe ideological or social, but there are like threads between them. Yeah.
manifestations that happen in those spaces. It seems to me that's a particular way of seeing opportunities or seeing possibilities in these bigger projects. Can you speak to that?
Well, I think like one of the things I talked about was this like non-paying entry. So like in every single project, you know, there's, I don't know, like I think the business school has 2 entries, and maybe it's a little too ambiguous because it has these 2 entries, so it's not like a clear front door. But there's always like a way that the public can kind of move through the architecture, just kind of unfettered, you know. So it's like you can be outside and still like experience the architecture. You can go from one level to another. You can kind of engage the building and the landscape. Like those are things that that we're really invested. Like almost every single project has something like that, and I think that attitude toward public and more privatized space, it kind of comes from, I think, one, working in the cultural context of Japan, where so much of the architecture is engaging nature and the landscape, but then it's also like our kind of interest in having the public, you know, kind of be a participant, even if they're not the main part of the story.
So thanks very much.
Thank you.
It's a challenge to me to kind of think about these 2 kinds of cultures. And the thing that is, the question that I'd ask is, because of the first part of that, wherein you were talking about a kind of series of logics, that embedded logics in a cultural situation that you were comfortable with and familiar with. I guess the question that I would ask is, as you move into Japanese culture, are there logics embedded in that you could extract from that work that would then talk about the fettered and the unfettered kind of ideas that would translate beyond the kind of formal characteristics into those that are really cultural? Because it's I don't know, but it seems like it's a pretty radically different kind of fettered space.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I didn't, like, there are stories that I kind of didn't tell. So the museum project, the stair, which was very open, there are 2 things about that. One is we sort of, in our residential work and in that project, we designed these like very light stairs, like very light touch, very open. And when the building was opening, there was a scandal at the university where the president actually had to step down because of because he was found, he had made a contraption to look under girls' skirts, which is, you know, this kind of peculiar thing that was happening a lot at that time. So because of that, we actually had to go and clad the stair. Like, I didn't show the pictures of it clad because that's not like the condition that we really that we idealized. But to me, it's almost like we had to put armor on it, and it was somewhat irrational, and it was really just fueled by this kind of cultural paranoia of just not wanting to have anything that, you know, might upset the public, and kind of draw attention where this person who had a high position, you know, kind of disgraced the school. So that's one. And the other is at the bottom of the stair. So it's like a steel and wood stair, very like refined materials, and it kind of ends with a concrete floor. It's totally fine in a European building, you know, contemporary architecture context. But when we, and it probably would be fine normally. But when we first opened the building, everyone was taking their shoes off and putting slippers on and going into the building. And there wasn't that kind of engawa or entry space. Like there wasn't a kind of transition from the stair. Like now I know there should have been a stone, which was different than the concrete that people could step on before the concrete. Because the concrete, even though it was highly polished and finished, was still kind of seen as being, because it just went into the landscape, as being part of the landscape. So it made this kind of schism where people didn't know what to do, between like their slippers and their shoes, and so that was like a cultural learning experience. And so as a result of that, I've actually been really interested in thresholds in Japan and Japanese entries, and I got like a small fellowship at Parsons, the new school, to study thresholds. I went last summer to Kyoto and just like was researching them, and I'm taking students there now. And for me, that's a kind of portal into looking at some of these like Japanese cultural issues. But also I taught in the women's studies department in Japan, and I taught about women in space. So that class for me was also a way of like just trying to understand like the kind of hierarchies of gender and the attitudes towards space in the culture.
That's great, thanks.
Thank you, Yolande.
Thank you.